Welcome to my channel. Here, we share inspiring stories of brave and strong people. Maybe you'll see yourself or someone you know in these stories. Thank you for watching. She never thought a quiet morning at her father's fishing dock would spiral into chaos. The low hum of motorcycle engines grew louder, shattering the peace of Eagles Point Harbor, until the iron serpents roared into view. Within moments, Laura Carter found herself surrounded by the most feared gang in 3 states. Their leader, Blade Walker, circled her like a predator sizing up his prey. Her heart pounded as his threats hung heavy in the air. But what these dangerous men didn't know, what no one in town knew, was that her quiet, unassuming father was far more than the humble fisherman they thought they could intimidate. David Carter's weathered hands and calm demeanor hid a lifetime of discipline and strength forged as a Navy SEAL. The iron serpents believed they'd cornered easy prey. They were about to learn how wrong they were. Some mistakes, after all, you only make once. Leave a comment and let us know where you're tuning in from. If you enjoy stories like this, hit subscribe so you don't miss our next inspiring journey tomorrow. Eagles Point Harbor greeted the dawn with a serene hush. The rhythmic sound of waves lapping against wooden docks. The small seaside community had an old-world charm, nestled in a curve of the coastline where fishing boats bobbed gently, and seagulls circled lazily overhead. Yet, beneath its picturesque exterior, the harbor bore the weight of struggles unseen. Businesses were shuttering, and whispers of trouble rippled through the townsfolk like the tides. David Carter, a man in his early 50s, moved with practiced ease along the dock, hauling ropes and checking the engines of his fishing boat. His graying hair, weathered face, and calloused hands told a story of years spent at sea. To anyone watching, David seemed the embodiment of simplicity, a hard-working fisherman tending to his livelihood. Yet, there was something in his gait, in the sharpness of his eyes, that hinted at a depth hidden beneath his quiet demeanor. He paused at the end of the dock, his sharp gaze scanning the horizon, as if his instincts sensed what the morning mist concealed. He wore a faded navy blue jacket and boots scuffed by saltwater, blending into the harbor's rugged environment. Only those closest to him knew of the life he had left behind, a life defined by discipline, danger, and the weight of responsibility. David Carter had once been a Navy SEAL, a title he rarely spoke of now. His days of covert operations and high-stakes missions were over, replaced by the steady rhythm of tides and the solace of the sea. "Dad!" a voice called out from across the marina. Laura Carter jogged toward him, her auburn hair pulled back in a ponytail that swayed with every step. She was in her late 20s, with a determined look in her hazel eyes that mirrored her father's. "Good morning, kiddo," David greeted with a warm smile as she approached. "You're up early. Someone has to keep this place running," she teased, motioning to the docked boats. "You've been so focused on the sea spirit that the rest of the harbor's going to get jealous." David chuckled. The sea spirit, his fishing boat, was his pride and joy. It wasn't much to look at, with peeling paint and a stubborn engine, but it was reliable, just like him. "Anything I should know before we start the day?" he asked, taking the clipboard she handed him. "Just the usual," Laura replied, leaning against a piling. "A few tourists booked a charter for later. Mike says the engine on the Lady Bell needs a tune-up." And she hesitated for a moment before continuing. "There's been talk about the iron serpents hanging around again." David's expression darkened slightly. "Where?" "Down by the old warehouse," Laura said, her voice lower now. "A few of them were spotted yesterday evening. Mike mentioned they've been asking questions about the businesses here." David's jaw tightened. though he kept his composure. The Iron Serpents were trouble, a motorcycle gang that had recently taken an interest in the harbor. Their presence had already unnerved the locals, their leather jackets and roaring bikes a stark contrast to the quiet charm of Eagles Point. For David, the idea of them disrupting the fragile stability of the community was unacceptable. "We'll keep an eye on it," he said, his tone firm but measured. "You let me know if you see anything suspicious. All right?" Laura nodded. "I'll be careful. Don't worry, Dad." David watched her walk toward the marina office, her steps purposeful despite the underlying tension. She had inherited his resilience, though he wished she didn't have to test it against threats like the Iron Serpents. For all her strength, Laura was still young, and the thought of her standing up to men like that made his protective instincts flare. The morning wore on, and the harbor slowly came to life. Fishermen prepared their boats. Vendors set up stalls selling fresh seafood and handmade goods, and tourists wandered the boardwalk with cameras in hand. David worked alongside his fellow dockworkers, exchanging friendly banter and keeping an ear out for any news. "Hey, David," Mike Turner called from the neighboring dock. The marina manager was a stocky man in his late 40s with a no-nonsense demeanor. "You hear about those bikers?" Laura mentioned it. David replied, setting down a coil of rope. "What's the word?" Mike scratched his head. "They're nosing around, asking about protection fees. Couple of shop owners said they've been threatened. We've got enough problems without those clowns stirring up trouble." David nodded thoughtfully. "I'll handle it if it comes to that." Mike gave him a skeptical look. "You sure? They're not the kind to back down easy." "Neither am I," David said evenly, his eyes glinting with a quiet confidence that left Mike momentarily speechless. As the day stretched into the afternoon, the unease around the harbor grew. Whispers of the Iron Serpent's activities circulated, and the usually vibrant atmosphere felt subdued. David kept a close eye on Laura as she moved between tasks, determined to shield her from any trouble. The peace of Eagles Point Harbor was fragile, but for David Carter, protecting it was a responsibility he would never take lightly. The tide was shifting, and he knew it was only a matter of time before the waves crashed against their quiet shores. When that moment came, he would be ready. The tranquil rhythm of the harbor broke as the rumble of motorcycle engines echoed through the air. It was a sound that didn't belong in Eagles Point Harbor, where the hum of fishing boats and the squawk of seagulls were the norm. Heads turned as the Iron Serpents arrived, their presence as out of place as a storm cloud on a clear day. The gang's leader, Blade Walker, rode at the front, his bike gleaming with polished chrome and black leather saddlebags. Blade was a tall man with a lean, menacing frame. His black hair was slicked back, and a jagged scar traced down the side of his face, a permanent reminder of a life lived on the edge. Behind him, a dozen other gang members followed, each clad in leather jackets adorned with the Iron Serpent's insignia, a coiled snake ready to strike. Laura Carter froze mid-step on the dock, her heart quickening. She had hoped the rumors were wrong, that the gang's presence had been exaggerated. But now there was no denying it. They were here, and they were looking for trouble. Blade brought his bike to a halt at the edge of the dock, the engine cutting off abruptly. The silence that followed was almost deafening. His piercing gaze swept over the harbor before settling on Laura. A slow, predatory grin spread across his face as he dismounted. Well, Blade drawled, his voice a low rasp that carried easily in the still air. "This must be the famous Eagles Point Harbor. Quaint little place you've got here." Laura straightened her shoulders, refusing to let her fear show. "What do you want?" she demanded, her voice steady despite the tension thrumming through her. Blade's grin widened. "We're just here to offer a little protection. You know. Make sure nothing bad happens to such a lovely spot. We don't need your kind of protection." Laura shot back. Her hands clenched into fists at her sides. Though she knew she was no match for the gang. Blade's expression darkened. And he took a step closer. "Now, that's not very neighborly of you. I'd hate to see something happen to this fine establishment of yours." He gestured vaguely to the boats and shops around them. The threat in his words unmistakable. Behind him, the other gang members began to fan out. Their presence an unspoken warning to anyone who might think of interfering. The harbor's usual bustling activities slowed as people took notice of the gang. Most locals ducked into their shops or turned away, unwilling to draw attention to themselves. Laura refused to back down. "You need to leave," she said firmly. "Now." Blade chuckled. A sound that sent a chill down her spine. "Feisty. I like that," he said, his tone mocking. "But here's the thing. Sweetheart. We're not going anywhere. Not until we get what we came for." "And what's that?" Laura demanded, though she wasn't sure she wanted the answer. Blade's grin returned, and he leaned in slightly. "A little cooperation. That's all. Just a small cut of the profits to keep things civilized." The meaning was clear, and Laura's stomach turned. They wanted to extort the businesses, using intimidation and violence to get their way. Her mind raced as she tried to think of a way out. A way to defuse the situation before it escalated. "I'll have to talk to my dad," she said, buying time. "He's the one in charge here." Blade's eyes narrowed slightly, but he nodded. "You do that. But don't take too long. Sweetheart. We're not the patient type." He turned back to his bike, signaling to the others to regroup. The gang's presence lingered like a dark cloud as they mounted their bikes and rode off down the dock. The tension in the air remained even after the roar of their engines faded. Laura exhaled shakily, her composure cracking now that the immediate danger had passed. She glanced around the harbor, noting the wary looks from the locals who had witnessed the exchange. Mike Turner approached her cautiously, his brow furrowed with concern. "You okay?" he asked. "I'm fine," Laura replied, though her voice lacked conviction. "But they're not going away, Mike. They're going to keep pushing until they get what they want." Mike nodded grimly. "I'll let your dad know. He'll know what to do." Laura bit her lip, worry gnawing at her. She trusted her father's strength and resourcefulness, but she also knew how dangerous the iron serpents could be. She didn't want him to put himself in harm's way, but there was no avoiding it. This was their home, their livelihood, and she wasn't about to let a gang of thugs take it from them. As Mike walked away to make the call, Laura stood on the dock, her gaze fixed on the horizon. The peace of Eagles Point Harbor had been shattered, and the weight of what lay ahead pressed heavily on her shoulders. She only hoped her father could find a way to protect the harbor and everyone in it. The sun hung low over Eagles Point Harbor as Laura Carter leaned against the counter in the marina office, the events of the day replaying in her mind. The tension in her shoulders refused to ease, and her hands still trembled slightly from the encounter with the iron serpents. Blade Walker's mocking grin and thinly veiled threats haunted her, and she knew they wouldn't stop at words. The office door creaked open, and Mike Turner stepped inside. He carried his phone in one hand and a clipboard in the other. His usual easygoing demeanor was replaced by a grim expression. "I got through to your dad," he said, setting the clipboard on the desk. "He's on his way." Laura exhaled a sigh of relief. "Thanks, Mike. Did you tell him everything?" Mike nodded. "Every detail. He didn't say much, but you know how he is. He'll handle it." Laura nodded. She trusted her father more than anyone. But the weight of the situation made it hard to feel reassured. "Do you think they'll come back tonight?" she asked, glancing out the office window toward the docks. "Probably," Mike admitted. "Guys like that don't scare easy. But your dad's dealt with worse, hasn't he?" She managed a small smile. "Yeah, he has." Mike's phone buzzed in his hand, drawing his attention. He glanced at the screen and frowned. "I need to take this," he said, stepping outside. "Keep an eye on things. Will you?" "Of course," Laura replied. The office fell silent once he was gone, save for the soft ticking of a clock on the wall. Laura's gaze drifted to the framed photographs hanging behind the counter. One showed her father standing on the deck of his fishing boat, the Sea Spirit, his expression calm and confident as always. Another depicted a younger David Carter in his Navy SEAL uniform, surrounded by his team. Her thoughts were interrupted by the distant growl of motorcycle engines. Her heart skipped a beat as she turned toward the window, straining to see through the dimming light. The noise grew louder, closer, until she could make out the silhouettes of several riders approaching the marina. The iron serpents were back. Laura's first instinct was to run, but she forced herself to stay put. Panicking wouldn't help. Instead, she grabbed her phone and dialed her father's number. It rang twice before he picked up. "Laura?" David's voice was calm but firm, a steady anchor amidst her rising fear. "Dad." "They're back," she said quickly. "The gang. They just pulled up at the marina." "Stay inside the office," David instructed. "Lock the door." "I'm almost there." "How far?" she asked, glancing at the clock. 10 minutes. Maybe less. Just hold tight and don't engage with them." "Okay," Laura whispered, gripping the phone tightly. "Be careful." "You too, sweetheart," David replied before the line went dead. Laura locked the office door and peeked out the window. The gang was parked near the dock, their bikes forming an intimidating line. Blade Walker stood at the center, talking animatedly with two of his men. She couldn't hear their words, but their body language spoke volumes. They weren't here for a friendly chat. Minutes felt like hours as Laura waited. She paced the small office, her nerves fraying with every passing second. The sound of approaching footsteps made her freeze. She turned toward the door, her breath catching as someone knocked. "Miss Carter." Blade's voice drawled through the door. "Why don't you come out and have a chat? We're not so bad once you get to know us." Laura didn't respond, her heart hammering in her chest. The doorknob jiggled, but the lock held. "Now, don't be rude," Blade continued, his tone mockingly polite. "I just want to talk." Still, she said nothing. She backed away from the door, her phone clutched in her hand. She considered calling the sheriff but knew it wouldn't matter. By the time they arrived, the situation could spiral out of control. A bright flash of headlights outside caught her attention, and relief flooded her when she recognized the truck pulling into the lot. Her father had arrived. David Carter stepped out of the vehicle, his movements deliberate and unhurried. He wore his usual navy blue jacket, but the way he carried himself was different now. The calm fisherman was gone, replaced by the composed warrior he had once been. "Evening, gentlemen," David called out, his voice carrying easily across the lot. "I'd appreciate it if you stepped away from my property." Blade turned, his grin returning. "You must be the famous Mr. Carter. Nice to finally meet you." David ignored the sarcasm, his expression unreadable. "You've made your point. Now it's time to leave." "Or what?" Blade challenged, stepping closer. You'll call the cops? Go ahead. They can't stop us. David didn't flinch. Instead, he took another step forward. His eyes locked on Blade's. I won't ask again. The tension in the air was palpable. The other gang members shifted uncomfortably. Sensing the shift in dynamic, Blade's bravado faltered for a moment before he recovered. All right, old man, Blade said with a sneer. We'll leave. For now. But this isn't over. David held his ground, watching as the gang mounted their bikes and roared out of the lot. Only when they were gone did he turn toward the office. Laura unlocked the door, rushing out to meet him. Are you okay? He asked, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. She nodded, tears brimming in her eyes. I was so scared. Dad. It's all right now, he said gently. They won't get the chance to scare you again. But even as he spoke the words, David knew the battle was far from over. The iron serpents had tested the waters, and they would be back. For now. Though, his daughter was safe, and that was all that mattered. David Carter stood on the porch of his modest home, the soft hum of the ocean breeze brushing past him. The sun was beginning its descent, painting the sky with strokes of orange and gold. It was his favorite time of day, a fleeting moment of peace after hours of work. He took a sip from the mug in his hand, savoring the warmth of his coffee as his mind wandered to the quiet simplicity of his life at Eagles Point Harbor. His phone buzzed on the small table beside him, breaking the calm. He picked it up, noting Mike Turner's name on the screen. A call from Mike at this hour was unusual. He swiped to answer. Mike, he greeted, his voice steady. What's going on? There was a pause on the other end, followed by Mike's unmistakably tense voice. David. We've got a problem. Laura just had a run-in with the iron serpents. David's hand tightened around the phone. What happened? Mike's explanation was swift and detailed. The gang had shown up at the harbor, their presence menacing and deliberate. They had confronted Laura, demanding protection fees and hinting at consequences if their demands weren't met. Laura had stood her ground, but the tension had been palpable. She's okay for now, Mike assured him. But you know these guys. They're not going to back off. I thought you should know. David's jaw tightened, his mind already racing through possible actions. Thanks for letting me know, Mike. I'll be there soon. Be careful, David. Mike added. These aren't the kind of people you reason with. David hung up and stood still for a moment, the weight of the situation settling over him. He set the mug down, his gaze shifting toward the horizon. The peace of the evening had been shattered, replaced by a familiar tension he hadn't felt in years. As he headed inside, his movements were deliberate, almost mechanical. He grabbed his jacket from the back of a chair and checked his truck keys, his mind already shifting into a different mode. It was a mode he had long since left behind but could summon in an instant when needed. The habits of a Navy SEAL were ingrained in him, as much a part of him as his heartbeat. The drive to the harbor was quiet, the road winding through stretches of tall pines and open fields. The scenery blurred as David focused on the task ahead. His hands gripped the steering wheel firmly, the call from Mike replaying in his mind. The iron serpents were more than a nuisance, they were a threat. And they had targeted his daughter. That was all the motivation he needed. His thoughts drifted to his time in the SEALs. The training had been relentless, designed to break down men and rebuild them into something sharper, stronger. He remembered the grueling days of BUD/S training, the cold Pacific waves crashing over him as instructors barked orders. It was during those moments that he had learned the value of resilience and focus. No matter how dire the situation, there was always a way through. One particular memory surfaced, a mission deep in hostile territory. His team had been tasked with extracting a hostage from a fortified compound. The odds had been stacked against them, the risks immense. But through meticulous planning and unwavering resolve, they had succeeded. The lessons from that mission had stayed with him: patience, precision, and the importance of staying calm under pressure. As the headlights of his truck caught through the dimming light, David applied those lessons to the present. The iron serpents might think they had the upper hand, but they didn't know who they were dealing with. David's thoughts shifted to Laura. She had always been strong-willed, a trait she had inherited from her late mother. He was proud of her courage but worried about the danger she faced. The harbor was her home, a place she loved as much as he did. He wouldn't let anyone threaten that. The truck crested a hill, and the harbor came into view. The familiar sight of the docked boats and the faint glow of the marina lights brought a sense of clarity. This was his domain, a place he had worked hard to protect and provide for. And now, it needed him more than ever. As he neared the harbor, David mentally prepared himself. He thought through the possible scenarios, weighing the risks and outcomes. Would the gang still be there? Would they escalate their threats? Whatever the case, he needed to be ready. He wasn't seeking a fight, but he wasn't going to shy away from one if it came to that. The truck rolled to a stop near the marina office, and David took a deep breath. The calm fisherman was gone, replaced by the disciplined strategist who had faced far worse than a gang of thugs. He stepped out, his boots crunching against the gravel, and headed toward the dock with purpose in his stride. The air was cooler now, the faint scent of salt water mingling with the distant sound of waves. David's senses were heightened, every detail around him registering with precision. He spotted Laura near the office, her silhouette framed against the soft glow of the lights. Relief washed over him at the sight of her unharmed, but his resolve hardened. This wasn't over. Not yet. As he approached, Laura turned and saw him. Her expression shifted from relief to determination. "Dad," she said, her voice steady despite the day's events. "I'm glad you're here." David placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "I'm here now. Tell me everything." She recounted the encounter with the gang, her words measured but tinged with lingering tension. David listened intently, his mind processing every detail. When she finished, he nodded. "You did the right thing standing up to them," he said. "But from now on, you let me handle it. They're not going to intimidate us." Laura looked at him, her eyes searching his face. "What are you going to do?" David's expression was unreadable, his voice calm. "Whatever it takes to keep you safe." The words hung in the air, a quiet promise that carried the weight of his experience and his love for his daughter. As they stood there, the harbor stretched out before them, its quiet beauty masking the storm brewing beneath the surface. David knew the challenges ahead, but he also knew one thing with certainty: he would protect his family and his home, no matter the cost. David Carter drove down the winding coastal road, the sun now a distant glow sinking beneath the horizon. The hum of his truck's engine filled the cabin, steady and comforting. But his mind was far from at ease. His thoughts spiraled through the events Mike had relayed, each detail painting a more vivid picture of the Iron Serpent's harassment. As he gripped the wheel, his knuckles whitened, though his expression remained stoic. The cool air seeping through the cracked window carried the scent of salt water and pine, scents that had become synonymous with home. But tonight, those familiar smells offered no comfort. Instead, they pulled him deeper into his memories, back to a time when danger was a daily companion and he had trained himself to face it head-on. The rhythmic sound of the truck tires against the asphalt was hypnotic, almost meditative. As David allowed his thoughts to drift, he remembered the first days of BUD/S training, the grueling gauntlet that separated the determined from the defeated. The instructors had been merciless, pushing each recruit to their physical and mental breaking points. Cold, wet, and exhausted, he had questioned whether he could make it through. But quitting had never been an option. A vivid image surfaced, the night his team had been tasked with navigating a labyrinthine swamp in complete darkness. Armed only with a map, compass, and their instincts, they had pushed through, their bodies screaming for rest, their minds on high alert for potential threats. That night, he had learned a crucial lesson: how to function in the face of overwhelming fear and fatigue. He shook his head, bringing his focus back to the present. The iron serpents weren't a sophisticated enemy, but their unpredictability and willingness to use intimidation made them dangerous. They were a storm that needed to be weathered carefully. As he drove, he scanned his surroundings instinctively, a habit he had never fully abandoned. The stretch of road ahead was empty, lined with dense trees that seemed to press in from either side. His eyes flicked to the rearview mirror, scanning for headlights that might suggest he was being followed. There was nothing but the quiet night behind him. His gaze drifted to the dashboard briefly, where a photograph of Laura was tucked into the corner of the frame. It was a candid shot, taken years ago at the harbor during one of their fishing trips. She was laughing, holding up a freshly caught fish, her auburn hair glinting in the sunlight. The memory brought a faint smile to his lips, but it was fleeting. The thought of her facing down the iron serpents stirred something primal in him, a fierce determination to protect her at all costs. Another memory surfaced, this one sharper, more immediate. It was of a mission in a remote desert village, where his team had been tasked with extracting hostages held by insurgents. The operation had been meticulously planned, every detail accounted for. But when things went sideways, as they often did, it was their adaptability that had saved them. They had moved like a single organism, each member anticipating the other's needs, their training carrying them through the chaos. David's grip on the wheel tightened. That mission had been a stark reminder of the cost of hesitation. When faced with danger, action was the only option. He had carried that lesson with him into civilian life, using it to navigate challenges both big and small. And now, it would guide him in dealing with the iron serpents. The truck rounded a bend, and the harbor came into view once more, its lights shimmering like beacons against the dark water. The sight grounded him, pulling him fully back into the present. This was his home, his sanctuary, and the thought of it being threatened filled him with a quiet but potent resolve. As he approached the marina, David slowed the truck, pulling into a gravel lot near the docks. He turned off the engine and sat in the silence for a moment, his eyes scanning the area. The boats rocked gently in their moorings, and the faint hum of activity from the harbor office reached his ears. It was quiet, but not calm. There was an undercurrent of tension that hadn't been there before, and David could feel it. He stepped out of the truck, the gravel crunching under his boots as he moved. The cool night air wrapped around him, and he paused to take it in, letting it center him. He had learned long ago the value of a calm mind in the face of uncertainty. It was the difference between success and failure, survival and defeat. As he made his way toward the office, David's thoughts shifted back to Laura. She had inherited her mother's fiery spirit and his own resilience, a combination that made her formidable in her own right. But she was still young, still learning. He couldn't let her bear this burden alone. He thought of his team once more, of the camaraderie and trust that had carried them through the most harrowing of missions. In many ways, his relationship with Laura was similar. She trusted him to guide her, to protect her. And he had never taken that responsibility lightly. Tonight would be no different. The door to the office came into view, its glass pane reflecting the dim light of the marina. David's pace quickened slightly, his body unconsciously shifting into a readiness he hadn't felt in years. The memories of his SEAL days, the lessons learned, the instincts honed, all of it converged as he reached for the door handle. He stepped inside to find Laura standing near the desk, her posture tense but her expression resolute. Her eyes met his, and he saw a mix of relief and determination in them. She'd been through a lot today, but she was holding strong. "Dad," she said, her voice steady despite the tension in the air. "I'm glad you're here." David nodded, stepping closer. "I got here as fast as I could. Tell me everything." As Laura began recounting the events of the day, David listened intently, his mind already working through possible scenarios and strategies. Each word she spoke added to his understanding of the threat they faced. And by the time she finished, he had a clear picture of what needed to be done. "You did well," he said, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. Standing up to them took courage. "But from now on, let me handle it. They won't know what hit them." Laura nodded, trusting her father implicitly. Together, they looked out at the quiet harbor, its calm surface belying the storm brewing beneath. David knew the iron serpents would be back, but so would he, ready, determined, and unshakable. The iron serpents had claimed the docks as their own, their motorcycles lined up like a barricade, chrome gleaming under the dim glow of the marina's overhead lights. The sound of laughter and rowdy banter filled the air as Blade Walker and his crew loitered near the waterfront. Blade leaned casually against his bike, his leather jacket adorned with patches and the coiled serpent emblem of their gang. He exuded smug confidence, gesturing broadly as he regaled his crew with exaggerated tales of intimidation. "This place is ours now," Blade declared loudly, his voice carrying over the lapping waves. "These fishermen think they can hold out, but they'll cave. They always do." The others laughed, echoing their leader's bravado. They lounged around the docks, their posture a mix of defiance and nonchalance. To anyone watching, they appeared untouchable, their dominance over the harbor seemingly absolute. But the mood shifted subtly when David Carter's truck pulled into the lot. The vehicle's headlights cut through the night, illuminating the gang's makeshift gathering spot. The low rumble of the engine as it idled momentarily muted their chatter. Heads turned toward the approaching truck, their expressions shifting from amusement to mild annoyance. Blade straightened, a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. Well, he drawled. "Look who decided to join the party." The old man himself. David stepped out of the truck, his movements deliberate and unhurried. He wore a plain navy jacket, jeans, and scuffed boots, a man who looked every bit the unassuming fisherman he had been for years. But there was something in his eyes, a calm intensity that spoke volumes to anyone observant enough to notice. He closed the truck door with a firm click and began walking toward the group. The gang watched him approach, their earlier mirth replaced by a cautious curiosity. Blade stepped forward, placing himself squarely in David's path. He stood a good 6 inches taller than David, and his presence was bolstered by the dozen gang members flanking him. "Evening, Mr. Carter," Blade said mockingly. "Out for a stroll? Or did you come to talk business?" David stopped a few feet away, his posture relaxed but purposeful. "I'm here to tell you to leave," he said simply, his voice steady but carrying an undertone of authority. "This harbor doesn't belong to you. It never has. And it never will." Blade laughed, a harsh sound that echoed across the water. Bold words for a guy standing alone. You sure you want to play this game, old man? David didn't flinch. His gaze met Blade's. Unwavering. I'm not playing games, he replied. This is your only warning. Pack up and leave while you still can. The gang erupted into laughter, their confidence unshaken. Blade's grin widened, and he took a step closer. And what's gonna happen if we don't? You gonna call the cops? David's calm demeanor didn't falter. You don't want to find out, he said quietly, his voice carrying a weight that made the laughter die down. The gang members exchanged glances, their amusement giving way to a flicker of unease. Blade's smirk faltered briefly, but he quickly recovered. All right. Tough guy, he said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. Let's see what you've got. He motioned to two of his men. Teach him a lesson. The two gang members stepped forward, cracking their knuckles and sneering as they closed in on David. One was a burly man with a shaved head, the other leaner but equally intimidating. They moved with the confidence of bullies who had never been challenged. David didn't move. He stood his ground, his eyes assessing every detail, their stances, their footing, their overconfidence. He waited until they were within striking distance before he acted. The first man swung a punch, but David sidestepped smoothly, his movements almost too quick to follow. He caught the man's arm, twisting it sharply and forcing him to his knees with a pained grunt. Before the second man could react, David delivered a precise strike to his midsection, knocking the wind out of him and sending him stumbling backward. The entire exchange lasted less than 5 seconds. The gang members stared in stunned silence as their comrades lay groaning on the ground. Blade's smug expression had vanished, replaced by a scowl. Looks like I'll have to handle this myself, Blade growled. Stepping forward, he pulled a knife from his belt, the blade glinting in the dim light. You think you're tough? Let's see how tough you really are. David didn't react to the threat. Instead, he spoke, his voice calm but firm. Put the knife down, Blade. You don't want to escalate this. Blade hesitated for a fraction of a second, a sliver of doubt creeping into his expression. But his pride wouldn't allow him to back down. He lunged forward, the knife aimed at David's chest. In one fluid motion, David sidestepped the attack, his hand darting out to grab Blade's wrist. With a swift, practiced movement, he disarmed him, the knife clattering to the ground. Before Blade could react, David twisted his arm behind his back and forced him to his knees. This is over, David said quietly, his voice carrying an edge that silenced the gang completely. You've lost. Take your men and leave. Blade struggled for a moment before slumping in defeat. David released him and stepped back, his gaze sweeping over the gang. If I see any of you here again, you won't get another warning. The gang members exchanged uneasy glances, their confidence shattered. One by one, they began backing away, retrieving their bikes and muttering among themselves. Blade stood slowly, rubbing his wrist and glaring at David. You'll regret this. Blade spat before turning and mounting his bike. With a roar of engines, the iron serpents retreated into the night, their dominance over the harbor broken. David watched them go, his expression unreadable. The tension in the air lingered for a moment before dissipating, replaced by the quiet sounds of the harbor. He took a deep breath, his body still and composed despite the adrenaline coursing through him. Dad! Laura's voice broke the silence as she hurried toward him from the marina office. Her face was a mixture of relief and concern. Are you okay? I'm fine, David assured her, his tone calm. It's over. For now. Laura looked past him at the empty docks where the gang had been. Do you think they'll come back? David's gaze remained fixed on the horizon. Maybe. But next time, they'll think twice. As the harbor settled back into its usual quiet, David placed a reassuring hand on Laura's shoulder. The storm had passed, but he knew it wouldn't be the last. Still, for tonight, Eagles Point Harbor was safe. And that was enough. The air at Eagles Point Harbor hung thick with tension. The gang's retreat from the initial standoff had done little to shake their defiance. But Blade Walker's composure was visibly cracking. As the leader of the Iron Serpents, he wasn't used to being challenged, let alone humiliated in front of his crew. But David Carter's unyielding confidence had unsettled him in a way he couldn't explain. We're not done here, Blade growled. Pacing near the waterfront, his men gathered around him, their expressions a mixture of unease and bravado. That old man thinks he can make fools out of us? We'll show him what happens when you cross the Iron Serpents. Mark Shields, Blade's second-in-command, stood a few steps behind him. Unlike the others, Mark's gaze lingered on the docks where David had last stood. There was something about the older man's calm efficiency that had struck a chord with Mark, though he wouldn't dare voice his thoughts aloud. For now, he stayed silent, observing the cracks forming in Blade's leadership. Meanwhile, David waited at the edge of the dock. His posture relaxed but his senses sharp. He knew the gang wasn't finished. Bullies rarely backed down after a single defeat. Instead, they regrouped, relying on numbers to mask their weaknesses. But numbers didn't intimidate David. He'd faced far worse odds before, and he was ready to do so again. The Iron Serpents reemerged, their footsteps heavy on the wooden planks. Blade led the charge, his jaw set and his fists clenched. Behind him, the gang members fell into formation, their bravado rekindled by their leader's fury. You think this is over? Blade spat, stopping a few feet from David. You think you can walk in here, humiliate me, and get away with it? David didn't respond immediately. Instead, he held Blade's gaze, his calm demeanor unshaken. The silence stretched, amplifying the tension. Finally, he spoke, his voice low but firm. You had your chance to leave peacefully. You made your choice. Blade's lips curled into a snarl. And you're about to find out what happens when you push the wrong people too far. He nodded to his crew, and the gang moved as one, encircling David. They advanced cautiously, their earlier overconfidence tempered by the memory of their comrade's swift defeat. Blade watched from the center, his eyes gleaming with anticipation. David's body shifted subtly, his stance widening as he prepared for the inevitable. He'd been trained for situations like this, to assess threats, predict movements, and neutralize targets with precision. The docks became his battlefield, every detail cataloged in his mind, the uneven planks beneath his feet, the positions of each opponent, the weight of the air. The first attacker lunged, a wiry man with a crowbar swinging for David's midsection. David sidestepped smoothly, his hand shooting out to grab the man's wrist. With a quick twist, he disarmed him, sending the crowbar clattering to the ground. A swift elbow to the man's temple dropped him unconscious. Before he even hit the planks, two more gang members charged in tandem, one wielding a chain and the other a length of pipe. David ducked under the chain, his movements fluid and controlled. He countered with a sharp kick to the knee of the man with the pipe, dropping him with a pained cry. Spinning on his heel, David caught the second attacker's arm mid-swing and delivered a bone-jarring punch to his ribs. The man staggered, gasping for air, before collapsing to the ground. The gang hesitated, their formation faltering as they realized they were outmatched. Blade's scowl deepened. But he barked an order, forcing them to regroup. "Don't just stand there," he shouted. "Take him down." Mark Shields watched from the periphery, his fists clenched at his sides. He couldn't deny the skill and precision with which David moved. It wasn't just strength, it was training, discipline, and experience. For the first time, Mark questioned whether they were on the right side of this fight. As more gang members rushed in, David's focus remained razor-sharp. He moved like water, flowing around his attackers and using their momentum against them. A punch here, a kick there, every movement efficient, every strike calculated. One by one, the Iron Serpents fell, their numbers dwindling as chaos erupted among their ranks. Blade's confidence crumbled with each passing second. The man he had dismissed as an old fisherman was dismantling his crew with ease, and he could feel his grip on the gang slipping. His pride refused to let him admit defeat, but doubt gnawed at the edges of his resolve. Finally, Blade stepped forward, pushing past the remaining gang members. "Enough," he roared. "This is between you and me now." David straightened, his expression unreadable. He gestured for the others to step back, and they obeyed reluctantly, retreating to the edges of the dock. Blade squared his shoulders, trying to project an air of authority despite the unease bubbling beneath the surface. "You think you're some kind of hero?" Blade sneered. "You don't know who you're messing with." David's response was calm and measured. "You're right. I don't know you. But I know the type. Bullies who think fear is power. It's not." With a snarl, Blade lunged, throwing a wild punch aimed at David's head. David sidestepped effortlessly, his movements deliberate and controlled. He let Blade's momentum carry him forward, then delivered a sharp strike to his ribcage. Blade staggered but quickly recovered, his fury driving him forward again. The fight was over before it began. David blocked Blade's next attack with ease, countering with a series of precise strikes that left the gang leader reeling. A final sweep of the leg sent Blade crashing to the ground, his breath coming in ragged gasps. David stood over him, his expression firm but not unkind. "This ends now," he said. "You and your men leave this harbor and don't come back. Understand?" Blade glared up at him, his defiance flickering like a dying flame. He didn't respond, but the message was clear. Defeated, he slumped against the dock, his pride in tatters. Mark stepped forward hesitantly, his gaze shifting between Blade and David. He opened his mouth to speak but hesitated, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. Finally, he addressed the gang. "Let's go," he said, his voice steady despite the turmoil in his eyes. "We're done here." The remaining gang members obeyed, their bravado extinguished. One by one, they retreated, leaving Blade to pick himself up and follow. His head hung low as the sound of their footsteps faded into the night. David turned back to the harbor, the quiet returning like a bomb. He exhaled slowly, his muscles relaxing as the adrenaline ebbed. The confrontation was over, but he knew the battle for Eagles Point Harbor was far from finished. For now, though, the harbor was safe, and that was enough. The quiet of the harbor returned as the roar of the Iron Serpent's motorcycles faded into the distance. The once raucous gang had dispersed, their confidence shattered by David Carter's swift and calculated takedown. The dock, now devoid of the gang's threatening presence, seemed to breathe a sigh of relief. But David remained still, his eyes scanning the horizon, his instincts sharp even as the immediate danger had passed. Blade Walker sat slumped on the ground near the edge of the dock, his pride as bruised as his body. His hands rested limply on his knees, and his head hung low. His usual arrogance extinguished. The man who had ruled through fear and intimidation now looked lost. His bravado replaced with quiet humiliation. Mark Shields, Blade's second-in-command, lingered a few feet away. Unlike the others, he hadn't retreated with the rest of the gang. Something in the confrontation had stirred within him. A deep and unsettling realization that their path was unsustainable. Mark's eyes flicked between Blade and David, his thoughts churning. David finally broke the silence, his voice calm but firm. "It doesn't have to end this way for you," he said, addressing Blade but glancing briefly at Mark. "You've got a choice. Keep going down this road, or walk away while you still can." Blade didn't respond immediately. He stared at the ground, his jaw clenched. When he finally looked up, his eyes were filled with anger. But there was something else there too, a flicker of uncertainty. "You don't know anything about me," Blade spat, though his words lacked conviction. David took a step closer, his expression unwavering. "I know enough. I've seen men like you before, men who thought they had no way out, who let their anger control them. It doesn't have to be that way." Blade scoffed, but the venom in his voice was muted. "And what do you know about it? You think you're better than me? You don't know what it's like." David's gaze didn't waver. "I know more than you think. But this isn't about me. It's about you, and the people who trust you to lead them. They're looking to you. And right now, you're leading them to a dead end." Mark stepped forward, his voice breaking through the tension. "He's right, Blade." The words came slowly, as though he were grappling with their weight. "Look around. What's left? We keep pushing like this, and it's only gonna end one way." Blade turned sharply to Mark, his eyes narrowing. "You're siding with him now?" Mark held his ground, his expression resolute. "I'm saying we need to think about where we're going. Look at what just happened. This isn't working, Blade. It hasn't been for a long time." Blade's shoulders sagged, and for a moment, he looked like a man carrying the weight of the world. His anger seemed to dissolve, leaving behind only weariness. He let out a long breath, his gaze drifting to the dark waters of the harbor. David watched the exchange silently, giving the moment the space it needed. He knew that pushing too hard could backfire, but he also recognized the importance of planting a seed. Whether or not it grew was up to them. Finally, Blade stood, wincing as he straightened. He turned to David, his expression guarded but no longer hostile. "This isn't over," he said, though the threat in his words was hollow. "But maybe you're right. Maybe it's time for something else." David nodded, accepting the small victory. "It's never too late to change," he said. "For any of you." Blade looked to Mark, then back at David. Without another word, he turned and began walking away, his steps heavy but deliberate. Mark lingered a moment longer, meeting David's gaze. "Thank you," Mark said quietly, "for not making this worse than it had to be." David inclined his head. "You've got a good head on your shoulders, Mark. Use it. Help your crew find a better path." Mark nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. Then he turned and followed Blade, leaving David alone on the dock. As the harbor settled into stillness, Laura approached from the marina office, her steps tentative but purposeful. She had watched the scene unfold from a distance, and her face reflected a mixture of relief and admiration. "You okay, Dad?" she asked, her voice soft. David gave her a small smile, though his eyes were tired. "I'm fine. Just glad it's over." Laura glanced toward the direction the gang had gone, her brow furrowing. "Do you think they'll be back?" David's gaze followed hers, and he sighed. "Maybe. But I think tonight was a wake-up call for them. It'll take time. But they might start looking for a way out of this life." Laura nodded, her shoulders relaxing slightly. "I hope so. They're not just bad people. They're lost." David placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "And sometimes, all it takes is someone to show them the way. For now, though, we can rest easy. The harbor's safe tonight." As they stood together, the gentle sounds of the harbor surrounded them, the creak of the docks, the lapping of the waves, the faint call of a distant gull. The storm had passed, leaving behind a fragile peace. David knew the challenges weren't over, but he also knew they had taken the first step toward something better. "Come on," he said, guiding Laura back toward the office. "We've got a long day ahead of us tomorrow." Laura smiled, a genuine warmth returning to her expression. "Thanks, Dad, for everything." David didn't respond, but the look in his eyes spoke volumes. He'd do whatever it took to protect his family and their home. Tonight had proven that, to himself, to Laura, and even to the iron serpents. The harbor lights flickered gently as father and daughter walked away, their steps echoing softly against the planks. The future was uncertain, but for now, Eagles Point Harbor was safe. And that was enough. The harbor was quiet, the soft sound of waves lapping against the docks filling the void left by the evening's turmoil. David Carter stood near the edge of the marina, his hands resting on the wooden railing as he stared out at the dark expanse of water. The adrenaline from the confrontation had faded, leaving behind a mixture of exhaustion and contemplation. The events replayed in his mind like an unyielding tide, each detail sharpened by his finely honed instincts. The iron serpents had retreated, but David knew that tonight's victory was only a temporary reprieve. Men like Blade Walker didn't simply disappear after a single defeat. Yet, amidst the tension and conflict, there had been something that caught David's attention, a glimmer of hesitation in Mark Shield's eyes. A crack in Tank's hardened demeanor. It was subtle but unmistakable. For all their bluster, these men were more than their gang personas. There was something deeper, something worth salvaging. David's thoughts drifted to his own journey. He had faced his own battles, transitioning from a life defined by discipline and danger to one centered around stability and community. It hadn't been easy. The ghosts of his Navy SEAL days still lingered in the quiet moments, memories of missions that had pushed him to the brink. Yet, he had found a way forward, carving out a life that allowed him to protect and nurture rather than destroy. As he mulled over the night's events, a familiar voice interrupted his thoughts. "David." Sheriff Tom Wilkes called, his boots crunching against the gravel as he approached. The sheriff was a tall man with a weathered face and a steady presence, someone who commanded respect without raising his voice. David turned to greet him with a nod. "Sheriff." Tom came to stand beside him, resting his hands on his hips as he surveyed the harbor. "Heard you had quite the encounter tonight. Want to fill me in?" David recounted the events with precision, his tone measured as he described the gang's arrival, the standoff, and their eventual retreat. Tom listened intently, his expression thoughtful. "Sounds like you handled it better than most would have," Tom said when David finished. "But you know as well as I do, this isn't over. They'll be back. And next time they might come looking for trouble." David nodded, his gaze returning to the water. "That's what I'm worried about. But I don't think all of them are beyond reason. There's something there, Sheriff. Something worth giving a chance." Tom raised an eyebrow. "A chance?" You think they're the type to take one? I think it depends on how it's offered. David replied. They're not just thugs. At least some of them aren't. I saw it tonight, Mark and Tank. They hesitated. They're following Blade. But I don't think they believe in what he's doing anymore. Tom's brow furrowed as he considered David's words. So what's your idea? David turned to face the sheriff fully. There's a veterans rehabilitation program up in Portland. It's designed for men and women who've fallen on hard times. A lot of them are former military. It's a way to help them find their footing again. Give them tools to rebuild their lives. You think the Serpents would go for that? Tom asked skeptically. Maybe not all of them. David admitted. But if we can get a few, Tank, Mark, to try, it could be the start of something. A way to defuse this before it gets worse. Tom rubbed his chin, mulling over the proposal. It's a long shot, he said finally. But it's better than locking them all up and waiting for the cycle to start over again. If you're willing to talk to them, I'll back you up. David nodded, a flicker of relief crossing his face. Thanks, Tom. I think it's worth trying. The sheriff clapped him on the shoulder. You're a better man than most, David. Let's hope they see that before it's too late. The next morning, David walked the length of the harbor, his steps purposeful as he prepared for the meeting with the Iron Serpents. Tom had agreed to arrange a sit-down with the gang. And though the logistics had been challenging, the promise of avoiding jail time had been enough to secure their cooperation. David's mind churned as he considered how best to approach the situation. He couldn't afford to come across as condescending or weak. He needed to speak their language, to meet them where they were and show them the possibilities they hadn't yet considered. When the appointed time arrived, David stood beside Tom near the marina office. One by one, the gang members filed in, their postures defensive and their expressions wary. Blade was absent, which didn't surprise David. The gang leader's pride likely wouldn't allow him to entertain the idea of rehabilitation. But his absence made the atmosphere less charged. Tank entered last, his massive frame taking up much of the doorway as he surveyed the room. His face was unreadable, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of curiosity. He moved to stand beside Mark, who offered him a nod of silent encouragement. Thanks for coming, David began, his tone even. He scanned the room, meeting each man's gaze in turn. I know this isn't where you want to be right now, but I'm not here to waste your time. I'm here because I think there's another way out of this for you. The room remained silent, the tension palpable. David continued, choosing his words carefully. Last night, I saw something in some of you, he said. A hesitation, a doubt. That tells me you're not as far gone as you might think. And that's why I'm offering you a choice. There's a program up in Portland, a chance to learn new skills, find steady work, and build a life that doesn't involve looking over your shoulder. Mark shifted uneasily, glancing at Tank. The larger man's brow furrowed as he listened, his arms crossed over his chest. Finally, he spoke. And what makes you think we'd fit into something like that? Tank asked, his voice low and measured. You don't know what we've been through. David met his gaze without flinching. You're right. I don't know all of it, but I know enough. And I've been through my own battles. I've seen what happens when good people lose their way. Programs like this work because they're built for people like us. Tank's eyes narrowed slightly, his expression contemplative. David took a step closer, lowering his voice. You've got the chance to be more than this, David said. To lead your crew in a way that builds something, instead of tearing it down. But it's your choice. No one's going to force you. The room fell silent again, the weight of David's words settling over the group. Tank and Mark exchanged a look, their unspoken conversation stretching over long seconds. Finally, Mark nodded. "I'm in," he said quietly, his voice carrying an undercurrent of determination. Tank hesitated a moment longer before sighing deeply. "All right," he said gruffly. "I'll give it a shot. But I'm not making any promises." David's lips twitched into a small smile. "That's all I'm asking for." As the meeting concluded, David felt a glimmer of hope. The seeds of change had been planted. And while the road ahead would be long and uncertain, it was a start. For now, that was enough. The Iron Serpents had gathered in the quiet, dimly lit room of the marina office. The air was tense, the gang members leaning against walls or slumped in chairs, their expressions ranging from cautious curiosity to outright skepticism. The sound of the creaking wooden floor was the only thing breaking the silence as David Carter stepped into the room, Sheriff Tom Wilkes at his side. David's gaze swept over the group, noting the subtle shifts in their body language, arms crossed defensively, glances exchanged, a few of them avoiding eye contact altogether. Blade Walker's absence was conspicuous. But David wasn't surprised. Blade's pride would keep him from entertaining the idea of change, at least for now. Still, the room's occupants included those David had seen hesitating during the confrontation, particularly Mark Shields and Tank, the gang's enforcer. "Thanks for being here," David began, his tone measured. He stood near the head of the table, his presence calm but commanding. Sheriff Wilkes remained near the door, arms crossed, offering a quiet but steady support. The gang members didn't respond, but their silence was enough for David to continue. "I know you're probably wondering why we're doing this," he said. "And I'm not here to waste your time. You all have a choice to make, and I'm here to lay it out for you." David turned to Tank, meeting his guarded gaze. The man was physically imposing, his muscular frame and tattoos signaling years of hardship. But behind the tough exterior, David saw something else, a man carrying the weight of his past. "Tank," David said, addressing him directly, "I know a little about what it's like to come back from a fight and not know where you fit anymore. You served, didn't you?" The room grew even quieter, the tension palpable. Tank's jaw tightened, and for a moment, it seemed he might ignore the question. But then he nodded, his voice low and rough. "Yeah. Army. 2 tours in Afghanistan." David nodded, his expression softening. "I figured as much. It's not something you forget. Those experiences, they leave marks. Some you can see, and some you can't." Tank shifted in his seat, his arms crossing over his chest. "What's your point?" he asked, though his tone lacked the hostility it might have carried earlier. David took a step closer, his voice steady. "My point is, I've been there. I've seen what happens when you come back and the world feels different. And I know how easy it is to lose your way." Tank's eyes narrowed slightly. "And what do you know about it?" David hesitated briefly, then spoke. "I was a SEAL. 15 years. I saw things that I've spent the rest of my life trying to make peace with. And I've worked with guys like us. Guys who needed a way to move forward. That's why I'm here." The room was silent again. But this time, it wasn't a silence of defiance. It was contemplation. Tank's posture relaxed slightly, though his expression remained guarded. "This program I'm talking about," David continued, "isn't just some slap on the wrist. It's a chance to rebuild. To take what you've been through and use it to create something better. For yourself. And for the people who look up to you." Mark Shields spoke up for the first time, his voice quiet but firm. "You really think that's possible?" After everything we've done? David turned to him, his gaze steady. I do. But it starts with a decision. It starts with you wanting it to be different. Mark nodded slowly. His brow furrowed as he processed the words. Tank, meanwhile, remained silent, his gaze fixed on the floor. Finally, he looked up, his expression a mix of skepticism and vulnerability. And what if it doesn't work? Tank asked. What if we try and we still screw it up? David smiled faintly, a hint of understanding in his eyes. Then you get back up and try again. It's not about being perfect. It's about not giving up. The weight of the moment hung over the room, each man wrestling with his own thoughts. Sheriff Wilkes finally spoke, his voice breaking the silence. This is your chance to avoid a record, he said. To stay out of the system and make something of yourselves. I don't have to offer this. But Carter's convinced me it's worth a shot. Don't make me regret it. Tank glanced at Mark, who gave him a subtle nod. The two men seemed to share an unspoken understanding. Finally, Tank let out a long breath and leaned back in his chair. All right, he said gruffly. I'll give it a shot. But I'm not making any promises. Mark nodded in agreement. Me too. If this is real, I'll give it a chance. David's expression softened, and he extended his hand to Tank. That's all I'm asking for. Tank hesitated briefly before shaking David's hand, his grip firm but not aggressive. It was a small gesture, but it carried a significant weight. The seeds of change had been planted, and while the path ahead would be uncertain, it was a step in the right direction. As the meeting concluded, the gang members filed out one by one, their expressions subdued but thoughtful. David lingered in the room with Sheriff Wilkes, the two men sharing a moment of quiet reflection. You think they'll stick with it? Wilkes asked, his tone skeptical but not dismissive. David exhaled slowly. I don't know, but I think they want to. And sometimes, that's enough to get started. Wilkes nodded, his expression softening. You're a hell of an optimist, Carter. David chuckled faintly. Maybe. But I've seen worse turnarounds. People can surprise you when you give them the chance. The sheriff clapped him on the shoulder. Let's hope you're right. For all our sakes. As the two men stepped out into the crisp night air, David glanced toward the harbor. The water reflected the faint glow of the moon, its surface calm and steady. For the first time in a long while, he felt a flicker of hope, not just for the iron serpents, but for the harbor itself. Change wouldn't come easily, but it was possible. And for now, that was enough. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to our channel, it means so much to us. Now, let's get back to the story. The morning sun cast a warm glow over Eagles Point Harbor, its golden rays reflecting off the calm waters and filling the air with a quiet optimism. David Carter stood on the dock, watching as Mark Shields and Tank arrived for their first day of work. The two men moved hesitantly, their postures rigid with unease. But David greeted them with a calm nod, silently inviting them to step into this new chapter of their lives. You're right on time, David said, his voice even and welcoming. That's a good start. Mark gave a small, awkward smile, while Tank merely grunted, his large hands stuffed into the pockets of his jacket. They both seemed out of place amidst the cheerful hum of the harbor, where fishermen exchanged jokes and seagulls squawked overhead. David could see the doubt in their eyes, the weight of their past choices still bearing down on them. All right, David continued, motioning toward a stack of crates near the dock. We'll start simple. Those crates need to be loaded onto the Sea Spirit. It's a lot of lifting, but it'll give you a feel for the rhythm around here. Tank glanced at the crates, his brow furrowing. That it? He asked, his tone carrying a hint of challenge. David met his gaze without flinching. That's it for now. Work's straightforward. But it's important. The harbor runs on teamwork. You'll see that soon enough. Mark nodded, stepping toward the crates. Got it, he said quietly. Tank followed, his movements slow but deliberate. David watched as they began. Noting how they moved, Tank's strength was evident in the way he lifted the crates with ease, while Mark's careful approach suggested a methodical mind. They worked mostly in silence, the occasional grunt or muttered comment the only sounds between them. As the morning wore on, the tension began to ease. Mark and Tank settled into a rhythm, their initial awkwardness giving way to focus. David stepped in occasionally, offering guidance without hovering, letting them find their footing. He knew better than to push too hard too soon. Trust wasn't something that could be forced, it had to be earned. One small step at a time. During a break, David handed them bottles of water and leaned against a nearby post. How's it going? He asked casually. Mark shrugged, wiping sweat from his brow. Not bad. Better than I thought it'd be. Tank took a long swig of water before responding. It's work, he said, his tone neutral. David chuckled softly. That it is. But there's more to it than just moving crates. You'll see as you get to know the people here. This harbor's more than a workplace, it's a community. Mark looked up at that, curiosity flickering in his eyes. A community? David nodded. Yeah. Everyone here looks out for each other. When someone's struggling, we step in to help. When someone succeeds, we celebrate it. That's how it works. Mark's gaze drifted toward a group of fishermen laughing as they prepared their nets. Sounds nice, he murmured, almost to himself. David saw an opportunity and seized it. It is. And it's something you can be part of, if you're willing to put in the effort. This place has a way of giving back what you give to it. Mark nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. Tank remained silent, but David noticed a subtle shift in his posture, a loosening of the tension that had been so evident earlier. The rest of the day passed without incident, the task simple but steady. By the time the sun began to dip toward the horizon, Mark and Tank had completed their work, their initial hesitance replaced with a quiet sense of accomplishment. David watched them from a distance, noting how their interactions had shifted. They spoke more easily now, their movements less guarded. It was a small victory, but a significant one. As they finished for the day, David approached them, his hands resting on his hips. Good work today, he said. You both pulled your weight. And it showed. The crew noticed, too. Mark's face lit up with a small but genuine smile. Thanks, he said. Feels good to do something real. You know? David nodded. I know. And you'll have plenty more chances to keep building on that. Tank, as usual, was less expressive, but he gave a single, curt nod. See you tomorrow, he said gruffly before heading toward the parking lot. Mark lingered for a moment, watching Tank's retreating figure. He's not as tough as he acts, Mark said quietly, a hint of amusement in his voice. David smiled faintly. Most people aren't. But give him time. He's trying, even if he doesn't say it. Mark nodded and followed after Tank, leaving David alone on the dock. The day's work had been a start, but David knew it was only the beginning. Change was never easy, especially for men like Tank and Mark, who had spent so long guarding themselves against the world. But in the small moments, a shared smile, a conversation, A job well done. David saw the potential for something more. As the harbor settled into its evening quiet, David allowed himself a moment of reflection. Today had been a step forward. A small but meaningful victory in a larger battle. And for now, that was enough. The second day of Mark and Tank's work at the harbor began much like the first. But a quiet transformation was beginning to take shape. David Carter stood at his usual post near the docks, observing as the two men tackled their assignments. The morning air was crisp, carrying with it the faint scent of salt water and the distant sound of gulls. For David, it was the perfect setting to begin laying the foundation of trust and growth. Mark was the first to arrive, his stride more confident than the day before. "Morning, Mr. Carter," he said with a small smile, his voice carrying a trace of optimism. David returned the smile with a nod. "Morning, Mark. Ready to get back to it?" "Yeah," Mark replied. "Feels good to be doing something that matters." Before David could respond, Tank's large frame appeared over the crest of the hill leading to the harbor. He carried the same gruff demeanor as the day before. But David noticed something different in his gait, a sense of purpose that hadn't been there before. Tank offered a brief nod in David's direction as he approached. "Let's get this over with," Tank muttered, though his tone lacked its previous edge. David didn't press, knowing better than to push too quickly. "You both did good work yesterday," he said instead, addressing them both. "Today, we're going to step it up. There's a boat that needs some repairs, and it'll take teamwork to get it ready. Think you're up for the challenge?" Mark nodded eagerly, while Tank grunted his assent. Together, the three of them walked to the repair dock, where a small fishing boat sat waiting. Its hull bore a few scratches, and its engine needed attention, but it was far from unsalvageable. "Mark, you'll handle the exterior," David instructed. "Scrub it down, patch any weak spots, and check the anchor system. Tank, you'll work with me on the engine. Let's see what's going on under the hood." The men set to work, the rhythm of their labor punctuated by the occasional exchange of instructions or observations. Mark tackled his tasks with growing confidence, asking questions when necessary and steadily improving under David's guidance. Tank, meanwhile, worked alongside David, his movements methodical as he learned the intricacies of engine repair. As they worked, David saw an opportunity to connect with Tank. "You've got a good eye for detail," he said, gesturing to the way Tank was examining the engine components. "Ever done this kind of work before?" Tank shrugged. "A little. Back in the army. I'd tinker with vehicles now and then. Never anything serious." David nodded, filing away the information. "Well, you've got a knack for it. With a bit more practice, you could make a real career out of this." Tank glanced at him, skepticism flickering in his eyes. "You really think so?" "I wouldn't say it if I didn't," David replied. "The skills you've got, attention to detail, patience, problem solving, they're valuable. All it takes is the right direction." Tank didn't respond immediately, but David could see the wheels turning in his mind. It was a small step, but it was progress. Nearby, Mark paused in his scrubbing and looked over at David. "You're different. You know," he said suddenly, his tone thoughtful. David turned to him, raising an eyebrow. "Different how?" Mark hesitated, searching for the right words. "The way you lead. You don't yell. You don't threaten. You just show us how to do things. Makes it easier to want to follow, I guess." David's expression softened. "Leadership isn't about forcing people to listen," he said. "It's about earning their trust and respect. I learned that a long time ago." and from what I've seen, Mark, you've got the potential to do the same." Mark's eyes widened slightly, as though the idea had never occurred to him. "Me? A leader? Why not?" David asked. "You've got a good head on your shoulders. And people listen when you talk. You just need to believe in yourself a little more." Mark didn't respond immediately, but a small smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. "I'll think about it," he said quietly, returning to his work. The day continued with the same steady rhythm, the men gradually growing more comfortable in their roles. By mid-afternoon, the boat's repairs were nearly complete, and the atmosphere had shifted noticeably. There was less tension, more cooperation, and even the occasional laugh shared between the three of them. As they finished up, David called them together, his tone serious but encouraging. "You both did great today," he said. "This boat wouldn't be ready without your hard work. That's something to be proud of." Mark grinned, wiping grease from his hands. "Thanks, Mr. Carter. Feels good to get something done." Tank nodded, his expression less guarded than usual. "Yeah, it wasn't bad." David chuckled. "High praise coming from you, Tank." Tank's lips twitched into a faint smile. "Don't get used to it." As the men gathered their things and prepared to leave, David felt a sense of accomplishment. The day had been more than just another shift at the harbor. It had been a step towards something greater, a glimpse of the potential that lay within Mark and Tank, waiting to be nurtured. For David, it was a reminder of why he had chosen this path. Redemption wasn't about erasing the past, it was about building a future. And today, he had seen the first bricks being laid. The docks were quiet as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over Eagles Point Harbor. Mark and Tank stood near the Sea Spirit, tidying up after a long day's work. There was a sense of accomplishment between them, a rare feeling that neither man had experienced in years. Mark, with a smile that had become more frequent, coiled a rope with practiced ease, while Tank leaned against a piling, gazing out at the calm waters. "Never thought I'd actually enjoy this kind of work," Mark admitted, his voice light. "Feels good. You know? To finish something and see the results." Tank gave a small grunt of agreement. "Yeah." Beats running from one mess to the next. The faint sound of an engine interrupted their moment of peace. Both men turned as a motorcycle roared into the harbor, its headlights slicing through the growing darkness. The rider slowed as he approached, and the familiar figure of Blade Walker came into view, his leather jacket and defiant posture unmistakable. Mark's expression tensed. "Great." Just when things were going well, Blade dismounted his bike, letting it idle as he strode toward them with a swagger that was more forced than genuine. His sharp eyes scanned the scene, taking in the freshly repaired boat and the tools neatly arranged on the dock. "So this is what you've been up to," Blade said, his tone dripping with disdain. "Playing house with the locals?" Tank straightened, his broad shoulders squaring as he stepped forward. "We're working, Blade. Something you might want to try sometime." Blade's lips curled into a sneer. "Working? Don't make me laugh. You think hauling crates and fixing boats is going to change anything? You think this guy," he jerked his thumb toward the marina office where David was still inside, "is going to save you?" Mark stepped up beside Tank, his voice steady but firm. "It's better than what we were doing before. At least here, we're not tearing people down just to make ourselves feel big." Blade's eyes narrowed, his gaze shifting between the two men. "You've gone soft, both of you. Following some fisherman around like he's your savior. What happened to having each other's backs? To loyalty?" Tank's jaw tightened, his voice low and deliberate. Loyalty doesn't mean following someone off a cliff. Blade. We're trying to do better. You should too. Blade took a step closer, his presence radiating tension. Don't tell me what I should do, he growled. I built the serpents from the ground up. Everything we have. Everything we've done. That's on me. And now you're just going to throw it all away? Mark held his ground, his voice unwavering. We're not throwing anything away. We're moving forward. You can come with us. Or you can stay stuck in the same cycle, dragging everyone down with you. The silence that followed was heavy, charged with unspoken words and clashing wills. Blade's hands clenched into fists at his sides, his face a mixture of anger and disbelief. For a moment, it seemed as though he might lash out. But then he took a step back, his sneer returning. You think you're better than me now? Blade said, his voice sharp. You're nothing without me. Remember that. Before either man could respond, Blade turned on his heel and stalked back to his bike. He mounted it with practiced ease, revving the engine loudly before speeding off into the night, leaving a trail of dust and tension in his wake. Mark let out a long breath, running a hand through his hair. Well, that went about as well as I expected. Tank shook his head, his expression hard to read. He's not going to let this go. You know that, right? Yeah, Mark said quietly. But we can't let him pull us back down. Not after we've come this far. David's voice cut through the quiet, calm but firm. You're right, Mark. You've made progress, and you've got to hold on to that. Both men turned to see David approaching, his steady presence immediately grounding the situation. He had clearly been watching the exchange from a distance, giving them space to handle it but stepping in when the moment called for it. Blade scared. David continued, addressing both men. He sees the changes you're making, and it threatens him. He knows he's losing his grip, and that makes him dangerous. But it also means you're doing something right. Tank frowned, his arms crossing over his chest. Doesn't feel like we're doing something right. Feels like we're just painting a target on our backs. David stepped closer, his voice low but steady. Change isn't easy, Tank. It's uncomfortable, messy, and it comes with pushback. But it's worth it. And you're not alone in this. You've got each other. And you've got me. Mark nodded, his expression softening. Thanks, David. It helps, knowing someone's in our corner. David placed a reassuring hand on Mark's shoulder, then turned to Tank. Keep going. One step at a time. Blade's not going to make it easy. But you're stronger than you think. Both of you. The two men exchanged a glance, a quiet determination passing between them. The road ahead would be anything but smooth. But they had taken the first steps towards something better. And they weren't about to turn back now. As the night settled over the harbor, the three men stood together, their figures silhouetted against the faint glow of the dock lights. Blade's threat lingered in the air, a reminder of the challenges yet to come. But for now, they held their ground, united in their resolve to move forward, no matter what lay ahead. Eagles Point Harbor was stirring with a new energy, a palpable sense of unity that hadn't been felt in years. The town, once weighed down by fear and apathy, was beginning to come alive, fueled by the resolve of its residents to reclaim their community. David Carter's stand against the Iron Serpents had been the spark, and now the fire was spreading. The transformation started small. Local businesses banded together, inspired by David's leadership and the changes they saw in Mark and Tank. At the harbor, fishermen who had once kept to themselves began working collaboratively. pooling their resources to repair docks and equipment that had long been neglected. The local diner hosted meetings where residents brainstormed ways to improve the town. From organizing neighborhood patrols to hosting community events that would foster a sense of belonging. David walked the length of the marina, his boots crunching softly against the wooden planks. He paused to watch a group of volunteers repainting the weathered facade of the harbor master's office. Among them was Mark. His shirt streaked with paint but his face alight with purpose. Tank stood nearby, his strong hands deftly repairing a broken railing. The sight brought a rare smile to David's face. "Looking good," David called out, drawing their attention. Mark grinned and waved. "Thanks, Mr. Carter. Starting to feel like a real community again." "Huh. It does," David agreed, his voice carrying a note of pride. "You're both doing great work." Tank nodded, his expression more subdued but no less genuine. "Feels good to be doing something worthwhile," he said. Across the harbor, a small group of residents was setting up tables for a fundraiser. The event, organized to support the veterans program that had helped Tank and Mark, had drawn widespread interest. Banners bearing messages of hope and unity fluttered in the breeze, and the aroma of grilled food wafted through the air. David approached Sheriff Tom Wilkes, who was overseeing the preparations. The sheriff's usually stern demeanor had softened in recent weeks, and he greeted David with a nod. "Turnout's looking good," Tom said, gesturing toward the growing crowd. "You've done something special here, David." David shook his head. "It's not just me. This is about all of us coming together. The town needed this." Tom smiled faintly. "Still, someone had to light the match. And you did that." As the day wore on, the fundraiser became a vibrant celebration of the town's resilience. Families gathered to enjoy food and music. Children played near the water's edge, and old friends reconnected over shared memories. Former gang members, now integrated into the community, worked alongside longtime residents, their efforts a testament to the possibility of redemption. Mark and Tank stood near the grill, serving food with easy smiles. The lines between us and them had begun to blur, replaced by a shared sense of purpose. For the first time in a long while, the harbor felt whole. But not everyone welcomed the changes. In the shadows of the celebration, murmurs of dissent lingered. Whispers about Blade Walker and Rex Carter, his volatile lieutenant, had spread through the town. Though Blade had largely retreated, Rex's presence loomed like a storm cloud on the horizon. Unlike Blade, whose arrogance often masked his insecurities, Rex was fueled by raw anger and a desire to control. He had gathered a small faction of loyalists who resisted the changes sweeping through the harbor, clinging to the old ways of intimidation and dominance. David's eyes narrowed as he caught sight of a few familiar faces lingering at the edge of the crowd. Men who had once stood with Blade, now watching the celebration with hardened gazes. Their postures were tense, their presence a stark contrast to the atmosphere of hope and camaraderie. It was clear they weren't there to join the festivities. Sheriff Wilkes noticed them too, his hand instinctively resting on his belt. "We've got eyes on us," he murmured to David. "I see them," David replied. "They're testing the waters, seeing how far they can push without crossing a line." Tom nodded grimly. "Rex isn't going to go quietly. He's not like Blade. He'll fight to keep what little power he has left." David's jaw tightened. "Then we'll show him that power doesn't come from fear. It comes from standing together." Later that evening, as the celebration wound down, David gathered Mark, Tank, and a few other key community members for a quiet meeting at the marina office. The mood was serious, the earlier joy tempered by the reality of the challenges ahead. We've made a lot of progress. David began, his voice steady. But we're not done yet. Rex and his faction aren't going to let this go without a fight. We need to be ready. Mark leaned forward, his expression determined. What do you need from us? David looked around the room, meeting each person's gaze. We need to stay united. Keep building the momentum we've started. Show them that we're not afraid and that we're not backing down. If they see that we're strong, they'll start to lose their grip. Tank nodded slowly. And if they push? David's expression hardened. Then we push back. But we do it smart. No violence unless there's no other choice. We show them that strength doesn't mean tearing people down. It means standing up for what's right. The room was silent for a moment as the weight of David's words sank in. Then, one by one, the group nodded, their resolve clear. We're with you, Mark said firmly. And the others echoed his sentiment. David allowed himself a brief smile. Good. Then let's get to work. As the meeting adjourned, David stepped outside and looked out over the quiet harbor. The waters were still, the reflections of the dock lights shimmering on the surface. Despite the challenges ahead, there was a sense of peace in the air, a reminder of what they were fighting for. The harbor had come a long way, but the battle was far from over. David knew that the coming days would test them all. But as he watched the community rally around a shared purpose, he felt a renewed sense of hope. Together, they could weather any storm. The harbor's transformation was undeniable. Yet the shadows of resistance loomed closer with each passing day. Rex Carter, Blade Walker's lieutenant and a man fueled by anger and pride, watched the changes from a distance with growing disdain. To Rex, the sight of former gang members working alongside the community was a betrayal. A slap in the face to everything the Iron Serpents had stood for. In a dimly lit bar on the outskirts of Eagles Point, Rex gathered his loyalists, the remnants of those unwilling to let go of the gang's dominance. The air was thick with cigarette smoke and tension, the group's restlessness palpable as Rex slammed his fist on the table. They think they can just erase us, he growled, his voice low but sharp. Carter and his little army of do-gooders think they've won. But this isn't over. Not by a long shot. The men around him nodded, their expressions hardened by frustration and loyalty to their leader. Among them was Troy, a wiry man with sharp eyes and a quick temper, who leaned forward. What's the plan, Rex? Troy asked. We're not just gonna sit back and let them take what's ours, right? Rex smirked, his confidence bolstered by the support of his crew. We're gonna remind them who runs this town, he said. Starting with those traitors. The first confrontation came 2 days later. Tank and Mark were hauling a fresh shipment of supplies onto the docks when Rex and a handful of his men appeared, their motorcycles rumbling like distant thunder. The sight of them sent a ripple of unease through the harbor, residents pausing their work to watch the gang approach. Well, look who it is, Rex called out as he dismounted, his voice dripping with sarcasm. The heroes of Eagles Point. Mark stiffened, his hands gripping the edge of the crate he was carrying. Tank, standing nearby, set down his load and turned to face Rex, his expression unreadable but his posture tense. What do you want, Rex? Tank asked, his voice calm but firm. Rex's smirk widened as he sauntered closer. Just checking in on my old friends, he said. Seems like you've traded in your colors for an apron and a tool belt. We're not part of that life anymore, Mark said, his tone steady despite the tension in the air. We're trying to make something better here. You should try it sometime. The words struck a nerve. Rex's smirk faltered for a moment, replaced by a flicker of anger. He stepped closer to Mark, his presence looming. "Better," he repeated, his voice low and dangerous. "You think you're better than me now?" Tank moved to stand beside Mark, his broad frame a solid wall of resolve. "This isn't about you, Rex," he said. "It's about doing what's right. For us. For the harbor. You don't have to like it. But you're not gonna stop it." The standoff drew the attention of David Carter, who had been working nearby. He approached with deliberate calm, his presence immediately shifting the dynamic. The tension in Rex's posture grew as David stopped a few feet away, his gaze steady and unyielding. "You've got a choice, Rex," David said, his voice quiet but firm. "You can keep fighting. Or you can find a way to move forward. The harbor's changing. Whether you like it or not. The question is whether you want to be part of that change or left behind." Rex laughed. A sharp, humorless sound. "Spare me the speech, Carter. You think a little hard work and a few banners are gonna fix everything? You don't know the first thing about how this town works." David didn't flinch. "I know enough to see what's possible. And I know that fear and anger won't get you there." For a moment, the two men stared each other down, the weight of their opposing wills hanging in the air. Finally, Rex stepped back, his expression twisting into a sneer. "This isn't over," he said, his voice laced with venom. "You'll see." With that, Rex turned on his heel and stalked back to his motorcycle, his men following reluctantly. The sound of their engines faded into the distance, leaving a heavy silence in their wake. In the days that followed, Rex's resistance grew more overt. His faction began disrupting work at the harbor, tampering with equipment and leaving threatening messages scrawled on the walls of the marina office. The community's resolve was tested, but under David's steady leadership, they refused to back down. Mark and Tank became central figures in the effort to push back against Rex's influence. Their intimate knowledge of the gang's tactics proved invaluable, and their determination inspired others to stand firm. The harbor's residents rallied around them, a testament to the bonds that had formed in the wake of the transformation. One evening, as the sun dipped low over the horizon, Mark and Tank sat with David near the edge of the dock. The day had been long, the work grueling, but the sense of progress was undeniable. "You think Rex is ever gonna let this go?" Mark asked, his voice heavy with concern. David considered the question for a moment before replying. "People like Rex hold on because they're afraid. Afraid of losing control. Afraid of change. But fear only has power if you let it. The more we stand together, the weaker his grip becomes." Tank nodded, his expression thoughtful. "He's scared. You can see it in the way he acts. But that just makes him more dangerous." "Dangerous? Yes," David agreed. "But not unbeatable. People can change. Tank, you and Mark are proof of that. And if Rex can't see that, then he's already lost." The three men sat in silence for a while, the gentle lapping of the waves a soothing counterpoint to the tension that lingered. The road ahead would be challenging, but they were ready to face it together. The atmosphere at Eagles Point Harbor was charged with tension. The morning sun glinted off the water, but its warmth did little to dispel the chill of unease that had settled over the community. Rex Carter and his faction had made their move, seizing a section of the dock and using it as a base to assert their authority. It was a clear challenge to everything David Carter and the residents had worked so hard to build. David stood at the edge of the main dock, his expression calm but resolute. Sheriff Wilkes was beside him, his hand resting lightly on the butt of his holstered weapon. Behind them, a crowd of harbor workers, local fishermen, and community members gathered, their faces a mixture of fear and determination. "We're not here to escalate this," David said, addressing the group. "But we're not going to let Rex and his crew take back what we've worked for. Stay together. Stay calm. And let's show them what unity looks like." The crowd murmured their agreement, their collective resolve bolstered by David's steady leadership. Mark and Tank stood at the forefront, their presence a testament to the possibility of redemption and change. They exchanged a glance, a silent agreement passing between them. "They're not gonna scare us off," Tank said, his voice low but firm. David nodded. "No, they're not." Rex's faction was huddled near the occupied dock, their posturing an obvious attempt to intimidate. Rex himself stood at the center, his sharp features twisted into a sneer as he watched the crowd approach. Troy and a few other loyalists flanked him, their arms crossed and their stances defiant. "Well, look who decided to show up," Rex called out, his voice carrying over the quiet lapping of the waves. "You bringing the whole town out to beg us to leave?" David stepped forward, his calm demeanor unshaken. "We're not here to beg, Rex," he said. "We're here to talk. This doesn't have to go any further." Rex scoffed, gesturing to his men. "Talk? What's there to talk about? This harbor was ours long before you decided to play hero. It's not about who it belonged to," David replied. "It's about what it can be now. A place for everyone to thrive. Not just a few who rule through fear." The crowd behind David murmured in agreement, their presence a silent testament to his words. Mark stepped forward, his voice cutting through the tension. "Rex, this isn't working anymore," Mark said. "Look around. People are standing up because they're tired of living in fear. You can keep fighting, or you can be part of the change." Rex's sneer faltered, but only for a moment. He turned his glare on Mark. "Don't think for a second that you can lecture me," he snapped. "You turned your back on us, on everything we built." Tank stepped up beside Mark, his towering presence commanding attention. "We didn't turn our backs," he said evenly. "We saw a better way forward. You can too, if you're willing to let go of the past." The silence that followed was thick with unspoken tension. Rex's men exchanged uneasy glances, the cracks in their resolve becoming evident. One of them, a younger man named Kyle, hesitated before stepping away from the group. "Tank's right," Kyle said, his voice wavering but resolute. "I'm done with this. It's not worth it anymore." Rex's eyes narrowed, his jaw clenching as he turned on Kyle. "You're seriously gonna walk away?" he growled. Kyle nodded, his posture stiff but determined. "Yeah, I am. I've had enough." His defection set off a chain reaction. One by one, other members of Rex's faction began stepping away, their loyalty to him eroding in the face of the community's strength and unity. Rex's anger boiled over, his fists clenched at his sides. "You're all cowards," he spat, his voice rising. "You think Carter's gonna save you? He's just using you to get what he wants." David stepped forward, his voice steady. "The only thing I want, Rex, is for this community to thrive. That's something we can all be part of, including you." Rex stared at him, his expression a storm of conflicting emotions. For a moment, it seemed as though he might lash out, but then his shoulders slumped, the fight draining from him. Without another word, he turned and walked away, his motorcycle roaring to life as he sped off into the distance. The standoff ended not with violence, but with resolution. As the remaining members of Rex's faction integrated into the community, the harbor felt lighter, its people more connected than ever. The victory wasn't just in driving Rex away, It was in proving that unity and perseverance could overcome even the deepest divisions. That evening, the community gathered once more at the marina, this time to celebrate their hard-won peace. David stood at the center, flanked by Mark, Tank, and Sheriff Wilkes. As the sun set over the water, casting the harbor in a golden glow, David addressed the crowd. "Today, we proved something important," he said. "That when we stand together, there's nothing we can't overcome. This harbor belongs to all of us, and it's up to us to keep building it into something we can all be proud of." The crowd erupted into applause, their cheers echoing across the water. For the first time in years, Eagles Point Harbor felt truly united, its people bound by a shared purpose and a renewed sense of hope. As the celebration continued, David stepped away from the crowd, finding a quiet moment to reflect. Mark and Tank joined him, their expressions a mixture of relief and pride. "We did it," Mark said, his voice filled with quiet wonder. David smiled, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "No," he replied. "You did it. You and everyone here. This is your harbor now. And it's only the beginning." The three men stood together, watching as the community celebrated around them. The road ahead would still have its challenges, but for now, the harbor was at peace. And that was enough. The old Iron Serpent's clubhouse had stood as a symbol of fear and control for years, its battered exterior a reminder of the gang's dominance over Eagles Point Harbor. But today, it was a hive of activity. Volunteers bustled in and out, carrying tools, paint cans, and furniture as the building underwent a transformation that would redefine its legacy. No longer a stronghold of intimidation, it was being repurposed into a veterans center, a place of healing and hope. Mark Shields stood at the entrance, surveying the scene with a mixture of pride and determination. His once wary demeanor had been replaced with a sense of purpose. He held a clipboard, checking off items as deliveries arrived. Beside him, Tank directed a group of workers moving a heavy table into the main hall. "Careful with that," Tank called out. "We're gonna need it for the workshops." David Carter arrived shortly after, his steady presence bringing a sense of calm to the bustling atmosphere. He greeted Mark with a firm handshake. "How's it coming along?" David asked, his eyes scanning the progress. Mark smiled. "Better than I expected. The community really came through. Feels good to see it all coming together." David nodded. "It's a big step forward. This place is going to mean a lot to the people who need it." Inside the clubhouse, the transformation was already evident. The graffiti that once covered the walls had been scrubbed away, replaced with fresh coats of light blue and white paint. The scent of sawdust and varnish lingered in the air as volunteers constructed bookshelves and workstations. What had once been a dim, oppressive space was now bright and inviting. In one corner, a group of residents set up a lounge area with donated couches and chairs. A woman named Susan, who ran the local thrift shop, arranged books on a newly installed shelf. "These were donated by folks from all over town," she told David. "Everything from history books to novels. Thought it might be nice for people to have a quiet spot to read." David smiled warmly. "It's perfect, Susan. Thank you." The main hall had been designated as a multi-purpose space, capable of hosting workshops, support groups, and community meetings. Mark and Tank had worked closely with David to design it, ensuring it met the needs of the veterans who would use it. A large table dominated the center of the room, surrounded by chairs, while a whiteboard and projector were set up at one end. "We're planning to start with job training sessions," Tank explained to David. "Basic stuff like resume writing, interview skills, and computer literacy. Figured it's a good place to start. David nodded approvingly. It's exactly what people need. Giving them the tools to move forward. Tank hesitated for a moment before adding, we're also thinking about running some mental health workshops. A couple of folks from the program in Portland said they'd be willing to come down and help out. That's a great idea, David said. It's just as important as job training. Maybe more so. You're doing good work here. Tank shrugged. But there was a flicker of pride in his expression. Just trying to do my part. As the day wore on, the final touches came together. The outside of the building, once covered in peeling paint and gang insignias, was now a clean slate. A new sign had been installed above the entrance, bearing the words, Eagles Point Veterans Center. The name was simple, but its significance was profound. It marked the beginning of a new chapter. Not just for the building, but for the town as a whole. The grand opening was scheduled for that evening. And as the sun began to set, residents and volunteers gathered outside the center. A small stage had been set up, and David stood at the microphone, flanked by Mark and Tank. Thank you all for being here, David began, his voice steady and warm. This building has a history, one that many of us would rather forget. But today, we're giving it a new purpose. The Eagles Point Veterans Center isn't just a place. It's a symbol of what we can achieve when we come together as a community. The crowd erupted into applause. And David continued. I want to thank everyone who made this possible. Your hard work and generosity have turned a place of division into one of unity. And to the veterans who will use this center, know that this community stands with you. You're not alone. As the applause swelled once more, David stepped back, allowing Mark to take the microphone. The younger man hesitated for a moment, but the encouragement in David's eyes gave him the confidence to speak. I'm not great with speeches, Mark began, his voice slightly shaky. But I just want to say thank you. Not just to the people who helped build this place, but to David. If it weren't for him, I'd still be stuck in a life that wasn't going anywhere. This center, it's a chance for all of us to do better. To be better. And I'm proud to be part of it. The crowd's applause was loud and genuine. And Mark stepped back, his face flushed but smiling. Tank took his turn next, his deep voice carrying over the crowd. This place means a lot, he said simply. It's proof that people can change. That we can all find a way to do some good. Thanks for giving us that chance. When the ceremony ended, the doors to the center were opened, and the crowd flowed inside to see the transformation firsthand. The reactions were overwhelmingly positive, with many expressing gratitude and amazement at what had been accomplished. David stood near the entrance, watching as people explored the space. Mark and Tank moved through the crowd, answering questions and sharing their vision for the center. It was a moment of triumph. But for David, it was also a moment of reflection. The clubhouse's transformation was a testament to the power of community and the possibility of redemption. It was a reminder that even the darkest places could be filled with light, given the right people and the right purpose. As the evening drew to a close, David stepped outside, looking up at the new sign. The words Eagles Point Veterans Center glowed softly in the twilight, a beacon of hope for all who would walk through its doors. For the first time in a long while, the harbor felt whole. And David knew that this was just the beginning. The opening of the Eagles Point Veterans Center marked a turning point for the harbor community. With the space fully operational, the focus shifted to building programs that could make a lasting impact. David Carter, along with Mark Shields and Tank, threw themselves into the task of creating initiatives aimed at helping veterans find stability and purpose. The first program they launched was a series of workshops designed to equip veterans with practical skills. The sessions were held in the center's main hall, where the newly refurbished tables and chairs were quickly put to use. Each week, a different topic was covered: resume writing, job interview techniques, and basic computer literacy. Local business owners volunteered their time to provide insight into what employers looked for, while David guided the discussions with his steady, empathetic leadership. Mark, who had once been a reluctant participant in anything resembling structure, now found himself thriving in his new role as a mentor. He stood before a group of veterans during a workshop on building a professional resume, his voice steady and confident. "I know it can feel overwhelming," he said, glancing around the room. "A lot of us have gaps in our work history or skills we don't think apply outside of the military. But the truth is, you've got more to offer than you realize. Leadership, discipline, teamwork, those are things employers value. You just need to show them how it translates." The group listened intently, nodding as Mark spoke. One man, a quiet figure in the back, raised his hand. "How did you figure out how to move forward?" he asked. Mark paused, his expression thoughtful. "I had help," he admitted. "David helped me see what was possible. And I realized that if I wanted something better, I had to put in the work. It wasn't easy, but it was worth it." David, standing at the side of the room, smiled faintly. Watching Mark grow into this role was one of the most rewarding aspects of his work. The ripple effect of change was becoming more evident every day. Tank's contributions to the center were equally impactful, though his approach was quieter and more hands-on. He took charge of the physical training sessions, recognizing that many veterans needed an outlet to channel their energy and rebuild their confidence. In the center's makeshift gym, Tank worked with small groups, leading exercises and sharing tips on maintaining physical and mental health. "It's not just about getting stronger," Tank explained during one session. "It's about discipline, structure. When you're out there on your own, it's easy to let things slip. But taking care of yourself, that's the first step to getting back on track." One of the participants, a wiry man named Greg, hesitated after the session ended. "Hey, Tank," he said quietly. "Do you really think it's possible to start over? To leave all the mistakes behind?" Tank's expression softened. "It's not about forgetting the mistakes," he said. "It's about learning from them. You can't change what happened, but you can decide what comes next. That's what we're here for." Greg nodded, his shoulders relaxing slightly. "Thanks. That means a lot." Beyond the workshops and training sessions, the center began hosting community building events designed to foster connections between veterans and the larger community. Potluck dinners, movie nights, and open mic events became regular occurrences, drawing people from all walks of life. These gatherings created opportunities for veterans to share their stories, building empathy and understanding among their neighbors. During one such event, a local teacher approached David with an idea. "We've got a lot of kids in this town who look up to people like Mark and Tank," she said. "What if we started a mentorship program? Pair veterans with students who need a little extra guidance." David's face lit up. "That's a great idea," he said. "Let's make it happen." The mentorship program launched a few weeks later, and the results were immediate. Veterans who had once felt isolated now found purpose in guiding the next generation, while students benefited from the wisdom and stability their mentors provided. Mark became a favorite among the younger participants, his straightforward manner and willingness to listen earning their respect. Amidst the flurry of activity, David took time to reflect on the center's progress. One evening, as he sat in the quiet lounge area, he was joined by Tank. The two men had developed an easy camaraderie, built on mutual respect and shared experiences. This place is something else, Tank said, leaning back in his chair. Hard to believe it used to be the clubhouse. David chuckled. A lot can change when people are willing to put in the effort. And you've been a big part of that. Tank shrugged, though there was a flicker of pride in his eyes. Just doing what I can. But I gotta say, it feels good to be part of something real. Something that matters. David nodded, his expression thoughtful. That's the key, Tank. Finding a purpose. For me, it's always been about helping others. And seeing people like you and Mark step up, that makes it all worthwhile. They sat in comfortable silence for a while. The hum of activity from the main hall a reassuring backdrop. The Veterans Center had become more than just a building, it was a beacon of hope. A testament to the power of community and the resilience of the human spirit. As the evening wore on, David couldn't help but feel a quiet pride in what they had accomplished. The work was far from over. But for the first time in a long while, he felt confident in the future of Eagles Point Harbor. Together, they were building something that would last, a foundation strong enough to weather any storm. The sun cast its golden rays over Eagles Point Harbor, a symbol of renewal in a town still adjusting to its transformation. The Veterans Center, once the gang's notorious clubhouse, stood as a proud beacon of hope. Its new life as a safe haven for struggling veterans brought a sense of pride and accomplishment to David Carter, Tank, and Mark. Yet, the story of transformation was not complete. There was still one figure who had yet to choose his path, Rex Carter. Rex had remained elusive since the standoff. His presence an undercurrent of unease in a community moving forward. Word had it that he was living on the outskirts of town, unwilling to abandon his hardened ways but seemingly hesitant to fully reignite the gang's dangerous past. David was overseeing a delivery of supplies to the Veterans Center when Rex appeared on the path leading to the harbor. His arrival was unmistakable, leather jacket scuffed, his steps heavy with uncertainty. There was no bravado, only the weight of someone torn between identities. David looked up from the crate he was unpacking. He didn't flinch. "Rex," he said evenly, setting the box aside. "Been wondering when you'd show up." Rex stopped a few feet away, arms crossed, as if bracing himself for rejection. "I didn't come to cause trouble," he muttered. "Just needed to talk." David gestured toward a nearby bench, his tone neutral but welcoming. "All right. Let's talk." The two men Saturday, the silence between them thick. Rex's eyes roamed the harbor, lingering on the bustling activity of volunteers, veterans, and former gang members now working to rebuild their lives. "I don't fit in there," Rex finally admitted, his voice gruff. "Never have. Never will." David studied him, his calm demeanor unwavering. "Why do you think that?" Rex hesitated. "Look at me," he said, gesturing to himself. "I've spent my whole life fighting to survive, pushing people away. I don't know how to do anything else." David leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "You're not the only one who's felt that way. Tank did. Mark did. Even I did. At one point. But they chose to try. Rex. That's all anyone can ask." Rex looked at David, his expression conflicted. "You make it sound simple. But it's not. I don't know where to start." "It's not simple," David agreed. "But staying where you are, clinging to the past, that's a choice too. One that'll keep you trapped." For a moment, Rex said nothing. Then, he asked, "Why do you care? After everything we did?" David's answer was immediate. "Because you're not beyond help. None of you are. And I don't believe anyone wakes up wanting to be the villain. I think you're here because you're tired of fighting yourself. The words struck a chord in Rex, and his resolve wavered. He looked away, swallowing hard. If I leave, what's left of me? David's voice softened. A man who's still standing, ready to rebuild. That's enough. After a long pause, Rex nodded, though uncertainty still lingered in his eyes. I'll think about it. David stood, offering a firm handshake. That's all I'm asking. The interaction with Rex left a mark on the Veterans Center. Word spread of his visit, and while he didn't immediately commit to the program, his presence signaled a possibility for change even in the most resistant. Tank, now a leader within the center, reflected on Rex's struggle during a team meeting with David and Mark. I see a bit of myself in him, Tank admitted. The anger, the fear of being seen as weak. It's hard to shake. David nodded. That's why we keep the door open. Not everyone will walk through it right away, but the important thing is that they know it's there. Mark added. And the more people they see choosing that path, the easier it gets to follow. The team's efforts expanded beyond Eagles Point. They began organizing outreach events in neighboring towns, connecting with other veterans who had fallen through the cracks. The center became a hub of resources and support, its influence growing as more people stepped forward to help. The broader community of Eagles Point Harbor also felt the ripple effects of the Veterans Center. Local businesses began offering discounts and job opportunities to veterans, inspired by the transformations they had witnessed. Schools organized events where students learned about the importance of compassion and second chances. Laura Carter played a pivotal role in bridging the gap between the veterans and the community. She spearheaded initiatives to collect donations, organize events, and educate the public about the challenges veterans faced. Her determination and kindness became a cornerstone of the center's success. Months later, on a brisk morning, Rex returned to the Veterans Center. This time, there was no hesitation in his stride. Tank was the first to spot him, and a knowing smile spread across his face. Looks like someone's ready, Tank said, nudging David. David walked out to meet Rex, who stood near the entrance, his hands shoved in his pockets. Welcome back, David said. Rex exhaled, a mix of nerves and resolve. I'm not promising anything, he said, but I'm here. That's all that matters, David replied, clapping a hand on his shoulder. As Rex entered the center, greeted warmly by others who had once stood where he did, David felt a quiet sense of victory. This was why he had fought so hard, not just for the harbor, but for the people who called it home. The morning sun rose over Eagles Point Harbor, casting a golden light on the bustling marina. 6 months had passed since the dramatic standoff that changed the course of the town's history. What was once a quiet, struggling community now thrived with activity, driven by a renewed sense of purpose and unity. The once neglected docks were now filled with boats bearing fresh coats of paint and repaired hulls, thanks to the handiwork of the reformed gang members. Tank, now a respected leader within the Veterans Center, supervised a group loading supplies for the community's monthly outreach program. He had grown into a steady presence, his booming laugh often heard echoing across the marina. Keep those ropes tight, Tank called out, grinning at a younger volunteer struggling with a knot. You're tying up a boat, not your shoelaces. Nearby, Mark Shields worked with a small group planting flowers along the walkways. The greenery added a vibrant touch to the harbor, a clear symbol of growth and renewal. Mark's once intimidating demeanor had softened, and he had become a trusted figure in the community. It's looking good, Mark, Laura Carter said as she approached. She carried a clipboard, checking off tasks for the day's projects. You've got a real knack for this. Mark smiled shyly. brushing dirt off his hands. It's easier when you've got people who care backing you up. The Veterans Center, formerly the gang's clubhouse, had become the heart of the harbor's transformation. Programs to support struggling veterans, from job training to mental health services, had drawn people from neighboring towns. The center had also become a gathering place for the community, hosting events that bridged gaps between veterans and civilians. Laura, who had taken on the role of community liaison, often found herself amazed by the stories she heard. One afternoon, she listened as a former gang member shared his progress with a group of students touring the center. "I thought I was too far gone," he said, his voice steady but reflective. "But being here, working with people who don't judge you for your past, it changes you. Makes you want to do better." The students nodded, their curiosity evident. Laura felt a swell of pride, knowing that David's vision for the center was becoming a reality. David Carter, the man who had quietly set the transformation in motion, stood at the edge of the harbor, observing the activity. Though his demeanor remained calm, there was a glint of pride in his eyes. He had always believed in the potential for change, even when others doubted. Mike Turner, the marina manager, approached him with a broad smile. "Never thought I'd see the day. David, this place is unrecognizable." David chuckled. "Takes a village, Mike, and a lot of hard work." "Still," Mike said, his tone serious, "it wouldn't have happened without you. You saw something in those men that the rest of us didn't." David shrugged. "Everyone deserves a second chance. It's just about giving them the tools to take it." The changes weren't limited to the harbor. Crime rates in Eagles Point had dropped significantly, and the local economy had begun to recover. Businesses flourished with the influx of visitors and the contributions of the veterans programs. One of the most notable changes was the annual Veterans Day fundraiser, which had become a town-wide event. Families, veterans, and local leaders gathered to support the center and celebrate the progress that had been made. The sight of the community coming together was a testament to the power of collective effort. As the day wound down, Laura joined her father by the docks. She looked out at the harbor, the boats rocking gently in the evening breeze. "It's amazing, isn't it?" she said softly. "How far we've come." David nodded, his gaze steady. "It's a start, but there's still more to do." The air at Eagles Point Harbor carried a sense of renewal and hope. But not everyone's journey toward redemption was complete. Amid the thriving projects and newfound unity, the shadow of the past lingered in the form of Blade Walker. Blade's name had almost become a whisper in the town. Many assumed he had disappeared for good after the confrontation, choosing to fade into the chaos he had created. But the truth was different. Blade had spent the past 6 months in a rehabilitation program, far from the harbor and the life he had once ruled with intimidation and fear. Now, he was returning, unsure of what awaited him. He walked into the harbor one crisp morning, his figure instantly recognizable despite the changes in his appearance. The confident swagger that once defined him was gone, replaced by a tentative and almost apologetic posture. His leather jacket hung loosely on his shoulders, as if it no longer fit the man he was becoming. The sight of Blade brought an immediate reaction. Conversations halted, and all eyes turned to him. Former gang members, now deeply integrated into the community, exchanged uncertain glances. Some tightened their grips on tools or buckets, as if preparing for a confrontation. Others simply watched, waiting to see what he would do. Blade stopped near the Veterans Center, his gaze sweeping over the transformed building. He hesitated before stepping forward, his hands open at his sides to show he meant no harm. Tank was the first to approach. his imposing figure cutting through the tension. "Blade," he said evenly, his voice carrying both curiosity and caution. "Didn't think we'd see you here again." Blade met Tank's gaze, his jaw tight. "I'm not here to cause trouble," he said. I needed to come back." David appeared from the workshop nearby, his expression unreadable. He walked toward Blade with measured steps, the weight of their history hanging between them. Behind him, Laura stood watching, her arms crossed and her face a mixture of curiosity and guardedness. "You've got some nerve showing up here," David said, his tone calm but firm. "What do you want?" Blade looked down, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides. "I've been through the program," he began. "I've been trying to get my head straight. And I know I've done things that can't be undone." David waited, saying nothing, forcing Blade to continue. "I don't expect forgiveness," Blade said, his voice breaking slightly. "But I wanted to face you all, to own up to what I did. And, if there's any way I can help, I'll do it." The words hung in the air, heavy with emotion. The silence that followed was punctuated only by the distant sound of waves lapping against the docks. Laura stepped forward, her eyes narrowing as she looked at Blade. "You hurt a lot of people," she said bluntly, "including my dad and me. How do we know you're serious about changing?" Blade met her gaze, his voice steady despite the vulnerability in his posture. "You don't," he admitted. "But I'm here because I want to try. I can't change the past, but I can do something now." Tank glanced at David, then back at Blade. "People don't forget easily," he said. "You're gonna have to prove yourself every day if you want to make this right." David finally spoke, his tone softer but still firm. "If you're serious, there's work to be done. But understand this, trust isn't given. It's earned." Blade nodded, relief washing over his face. "I understand," he said. "I'll do whatever it takes." David assigned Blade to a cleanup crew working on the outskirts of the harbor, far from the main activity. It was a test, not just of Blade's willingness to work but of his ability to face the skepticism and resentment of those around him. At first, the tension was palpable. Former gang members who had embraced their new roles were wary of Blade, unsure if he could be trusted. The community members, too, kept their distance, their eyes often lingering on him with suspicion. But Blade remained steadfast. He worked hard, never complaining, and kept his head down. When someone snapped at him or questioned his presence, he responded calmly, apologizing for the harm he had caused and reiterating his commitment to change. Over time, his quiet determination began to chip away at the walls others had built around him. One of the first to acknowledge his efforts was Mark, who approached Blade during a break one afternoon. "You're different," Mark said, his tone more curious than accusatory. Blade looked up from the piece of netting he was mending. "Trying to be," he replied simply. Mark nodded, as if satisfied with the answer. "Keep it up," he said before walking away. Blade's progress was slow but steady. He began volunteering at the Veterans Center, assisting with tasks that required patience and focus. Tank kept a close eye on him, occasionally offering guidance or encouragement. Laura, though still cautious, started to see glimpses of sincerity in Blade's actions. One day, Blade found himself helping a young veteran who was struggling with anger issues. The veteran's frustration was palpable as he vented about feeling misunderstood and trapped. "I know what that's like," Blade said quietly, his own emotions surfacing. "Feeling like you're stuck in a cycle you can't break. But you can break it. If I can, anyone can." The veteran looked at him, surprised by the admission. For the first time, Blade felt like he was doing something truly meaningful. The transformation of Eagles Point Harbor had become more than just a local story. The work of the Veterans Center and the unity of the community drew attention from surrounding towns, inspiring similar initiatives. For David Carter, the journey was deeply personal, and as he watched the final preparations for the day's celebration at the marina, he couldn't help but reflect on the past. Standing on the newly rebuilt dock, David gazed out at the water. The sun's rays danced on the surface, casting a warm glow that mirrored the sense of hope in the harbor. Laura joined him, her arms crossed as she took in the scene. "We've come a long way," she said, her voice tinged with pride. David nodded. "It wasn't easy, but it was worth it. Everyone here played a part in making this happen." Laura smiled, her eyes glinting with mischief. "Including you, even if you won't admit it." David chuckled. "I just gave them a push. They did the rest." The marina was alive with activity as the community gathered for the unveiling of a commemorative plaque. Banners hung between lampposts, and tables were lined with food prepared by local families. Former gang members mingled with veterans, business owners, and children, the lines between past and present blurred by shared purpose. At the center of the festivities, the Veterans Center stood as a testament to what could be achieved when people worked together. Tank and Mark stood near the entrance, greeting attendees with smiles and handshakes. Even Blade was there, working quietly in the background to set up chairs and ensure everything ran smoothly. As the crowd grew, Sheriff Tom Wilkes stepped onto a small stage that had been set up near the docks. He adjusted the microphone and cleared his throat, drawing everyone's attention. "Good afternoon, everyone," he began, his voice carrying easily over the murmurs. "Today, we celebrate not just the transformation of this harbor but the transformation of lives. What we've built here is more than a center, it's a second chance for those who needed it most." The crowd erupted into applause, and Wilkes raised a hand to quiet them. But none of this would have been possible without the leadership and vision of one man. "David Carter. Would you join me up here?" David hesitated, glancing at Laura, who gave him an encouraging nod. With a resigned sigh, he made his way to the stage, greeted by a wave of cheers and clapping. Taking the microphone from Wilkes, he surveyed the crowd, his expression thoughtful. "I'm not one for speeches," he began, eliciting a chuckle from the audience. "But I'll say this, none of this was about me. It was about us, every single person here. Whether you showed up to lend a hand, gave someone a second chance, or simply believed that change was possible, you're the reason we're standing here today." His gaze shifted to Tank, Mark, and even Blade, who stood at the edge of the crowd. "I've seen what happens when people are written off, treated like they're beyond saving. And I've seen what happens when we give them a chance to prove otherwise. What we've built here is proof that no one is beyond redemption." The applause that followed was thunderous, and David stepped back, nodding to Wilkes as he retook his seat. The plaque was draped in a cloth, positioned prominently at the center of the marina. Laura was invited to join David and Wilkes on stage to unveil it. As the cloth was pulled away, the inscription revealed a heartfelt dedication, in honor of those who dared to believe in second chances. "May this harbor stand as a beacon of hope for generations to come." The crowd erupted in cheers, many wiping away tears as they read the words. For Blade, standing among the people he had once alienated, the moment was particularly emotional. He felt a weight lift from his shoulders, replaced by a sense of belonging he hadn't felt in years. As the celebration continued, Blade approached David, who was speaking with a group of veterans. He waited patiently until the conversation ended, then stepped forward. "David," Blade began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I just wanted to say thank you for giving me a chance, even when I didn't deserve it." David regarded him with a faint smile. "You earned it, Blade. And it's just the beginning." Blade nodded, his expression resolute. "I won't let you down." Nearby, Laura watched the exchange, her heart swelling with pride. The man who had once been their greatest threat was now a testament to the power of change. As the sun set, casting the harbor in hues of orange and pink, music filled the air, and the community came together to celebrate. Laughter and conversation flowed freely. And for one night, the struggles of the past were replaced by the promise of a brighter future. David stood with Laura at the edge of the docks, watching the festivities. She leaned against his shoulder, her voice soft. "Think we've earned a little rest?" He smiled. "Maybe. But there's always more to do." "Typical," she teased, though her tone was affectionate. The harbor, once a place of division and despair, now stood as a symbol of hope and resilience. For David, Laura, and everyone who had played a part, it was a reminder that even in the darkest moments, the light of second chances could shine through.